Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Susan Messino. I'm a professor at Trinity College, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the next speaker in the Restore Speaker Series. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Trinity College, Restore the North Woods, Walden Woods, the Olmsted Network, and the Collaborative Campaign to Protect Wildlands of Climate Action Now of Western Massachusetts. So I'm really honored to be here this evening and to be Restore's first official fellow. And if you're not familiar with the organization Restore the North Woods, I highly recommend that you check them out at restore.org and get on the email list. The executive director, Michael Kellett, sends out excellent information and that everyone should be aware of. I want to let everyone know that we're going to be leaving ample time for questions at the end of the presentation, and we have automatic closed captioning if you want to turn that on. We're recording this, we'll send it out to everyone, and without further ado, it is my real pleasure and honor to introduce Michael Kellett of Restore the North Woods. And he has been advocating for national parks, wilderness areas, wild and scenic rivers, and imperiled wildlife for decades. And he really advocated for what has now become Katahdin Woods and Waters. Originally was advocating for a Maine Woods National Park. And currently he is working on some legislation in Massachusetts to try and protect public lands as reserves. And he's visited more than 260 national park areas across the country. And so without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Michael to tell you a little bit more.
Hi, thanks, Susan. Thanks, everybody, for being on board here. Just a quick thing about why are we doing this series on national parks, past, present, and future. Um, Yellowstone National Park was created in 1872, and we've created a lot more of them over the years. Most people have been to a national park and like national parks, and so what's to talk about? What's the new thing to talk about? But the reality is most people don't know that much about the history of why national parks happen in the first place. They don't know that much about the challenges of creating them. And that right now, people may well have heard about the challenges of keeping them protected because there's more and more of a push to privatize or weaken national park protection. And especially with the new information we have about the importance of climate, of protecting the planet from climate change, of protecting biodiversity and wildlife, and having healthy green spaces for our people. National parks are more important than ever. So now is not the time for us to back off and say, "Oh, geez, some people are complaining about national parks. In reality, national parks are ultra popular. There have been public opinion surveys over and over again that show that, in fact, national parks are the most popular federal agency nowadays. We're just above the post office. So um, but people need to know about parks or we can't defend them and support creating new parks, which is what we're talking about. So um, uh, I'm going to turn it over to Dina Charm, who's going to talk about, who's going to take it to the next step. She's been super helpful in pulling all this together, and she's going to introduce Laurence Cotton.
Thanks, Michael. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Restore Speaker Series titled National Past, Present, and Future. My name is Dina Chime. I'm a sophomore at Trinity College, majoring in economics, and we are thrilled to welcome public historian and film producer Laurence Cotton, who will offer a presentation titled Frederick Law Olmsted, the Natural Democracy of Parks. And Laurence Cotton and Ken Burns started out their careers together at Hampshire College, studied with the same film faculty and produced an early student film together. But as our guest speaker likes to tell it, Ken Burns majored in film, whereas Laurence majored in cultural anthropology and minored in film. And as they said, the rest is history. So,
Am I on?
yep,
Yeah,
you guys.
okay,
Yes,
fine.
welcome, Larry.
Okay, hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Hold on, let me get into some screen sharing, everyone. Bear with me a minute. Good to see everyone here. And great. Hi, everyone.
Got it.
Thanks for the introduction, Dina. It's truly affirming to know that there are so many people with us today who are clearly interested in the name Olmsted. As many of you know, there was a great deal of activity during the cycle of the Olmsted Bicentennial a couple of years ago. We called it Olmsted 200. Of course, Mr. Olmsted, we just celebrated, if you will, commemorated his 203rd birthday on April 26th. The Olmsted Network, formerly called the National Association for Olmsted Parks, led the charge, and many of us across North America joined in one capacity or another during that bicentennial period. It's truly an honor to present to an audience gathered online this evening. I want to extend many thanks to my thanks to all of those who've made it possible. We've already seen their organizational titles credited, but in particular, I want to offer my own personal thanks to Michael Kellett with Restore and my friend and compatriot on the Olmsted path, Susan Messino at Trinity College. And of course, Dina, thank you also for your logistical support. My plan is this: I will review Olmsted's life and career. Then we will explore the Olmsted legacy across North America, including Olmsted Sr. I'll also examine some of the works of the two sons, with a greater focus on Junior, maybe a little less so on John Charles this particular moment today, but I'll reference him too. I also have to remind you that when I feature Olmsted sites across the country, I'm simply touching on highlights. This is by no means a comprehensive survey, though I will try to do some justice to the weighty theme, the natural democracy of parks. Again, I'll just skim the surface of that topic. And at the end of the program, I'll highlight a few resources, in principal books, to call your attention to that do relate to today's topic. But first, allow me to reintroduce, if you will, to all of you, Frederick Law Olmsted. Here's a colorful description of the man by his friend, George Templeton Strong, a well-known public figure and diarist of the day. Of course, if I can get my slides to advance, that would be helpful. There we go. This is, again, from George Templeton Strong, describing the individual you see on your screen, Mr. Olmsted. He is an extraordinary fellow, talent and energy the most rare, absolute purity and disinterestedness, prominent defects and monomania for system and organization. He works like a dog all day, sits up nearly all night, doesn't go home to his family for 5 days together, works with steady, feverish intensity till 4 in the morning, sleeps on a sofa in his clothes, and breakfasts on strong coffee and pickles. Well, I don't know about all of you. I did breakfast on strong coffee at about 6 a.m. today, but I abstained from pickles for the moment. I might have them later tonight. Here is Frederick himself reminiscing on his boyhood. I was very active, imaginative, inventive, impulsive, enterprising, trustful, and heedless, a troublesome and mischievous boy. Later he wrote this: I was nominally the pupil of a topographical engineer, but really for the most part given over to a decently restrained vagabond life, generally pursued under the guise of an angler, a fowler, or a dabbler on the shallowest shores of the deep sea of the natural sciences. Well, that mischievous boy turned vagabond certainly eventually made something of his life. I hope you come away from today's program with a more enhanced feel for this man and what made him tick. Central Park, Brooklyn's Prospect Park, Boston's famed Emerald Necklace, the White City of the Chicago World's Fair, the park systems of Buffalo. Here is Delaware Park, part of that park system, and Louisville. Here's Cherokee Park, part of the Louisville system. Legacy Parks in Chicago. Here's Jackson Park in Chicago, the Japanese Garden specifically. Here is Belle Isle in Detroit, a state park now in practically adjacent to downtown Detroit, one of the largest protected islands of its kind in the Great Lakes. Here is the Olmsted Linear Park, Druid Hills in Atlanta. Here is the Biltmore Estate, the U.S. Capitol grounds, Riverside, Illinois, one of the first intentionally designed green garden suburbs in the United States. Mount Royal Park in Montreal, we cannot neglect this principal park site in Canada, although there are others. And how about the Niagara Falls State Reservation? Well, those are just a handful of the more celebrated, masterful landscapes designed by Frederick Law Olmsted. And if we add in the park designs and landscapes carried out by his two sons and the Olmsted Brothers firm, the imprint across the geography of North America is simply astounding, as represented by all those little green dots. 700 public parks and actually 6,000 commissions during the life of the Olmsted Brothers firm. I want to share a few items for media coverage in recent years. With an initial focus on the West Coast, I'd like to introduce West Coast themes when I'm principally speaking to Eastern audiences. I've lived on the West Coast. By the way, I'm speaking to you virtually, if you will, from the primo Olmsted Park of Portland, Oregon, Laurelhurst Park. It's designed by, or master planned, I might say, by John Charles Olmsted. It was actually carried out by the anointed first superintendent of the park system here. It's just a mile away from where I'm speaking to you right now, Laurelhurst Park. But I've lived on the West Coast for some time, but I was raised in New England. And I do frequently travel around the U.S. presenting the program. When east of the Mississippi, audiences there think they own Olmsted, particularly New Yorkers, and I dare say Bostonians and Buffalonians as well. But the Olmsted legacy does spread across the continent. On the opinion pages of the LA Times, the column Building a Livable Los Angeles, that was the title of the column, quote, in 1930, with LA's population on the verge of exploding, the sons of Frederick Law Olmsted were commissioned to draw up a master plan for the Los Angeles basin. The brothers came back with an intensive study of the ecology of the Los Angeles watershed, including plans for park space, flood control, traffic abatement, recreation, and the city's overall sustainable ecological development. The report was praised for its vision, clarity, and beauty, and it was immediately shelved. And if the Olmsted Brothers' 1930 plan with Bartholomew and Associates had only been acted upon by the city leaders of LA in the 1930s, modern LA would have a very different green look to it, I guarantee you. Perhaps some in our audience read this a few years ago in the New York Review of Books, an article titled America's Green Giant by scholar Martin Filler, including discussion of new volumes by and about Frederick Law Olmsted, including this one featured here. After initially calling attention to the acclaim that has been received by the High Line Linear Park along Manhattan's west side, scholar Filler writes this. Yet, however much the High Line has enriched the post-millennial megalopolis, its social effects pale in comparison to the revolutionary vision of the public park as promulgated by its greatest American exponent, the 19th century polymath, Frederick Law Olmsted. Perhaps some of you read this during the COVID winter of 2021. In the pages of the New York Times, a moving essay by Michiko Kakutani, who is, in fact, an avid birdwatcher. The heading was Finding Refuge in a Snowy Owl in Central Park. And this is but an extract, and here we'll have a nice wintertime image of Central Park while I share this with you. I'm reading from her essay. Central Park has long provided a refuge from the anxieties and stresses of daily life, perhaps never more so than during the coronavirus. New Yorkers who visited the park every day, as well as those who have long taken it for granted, felt a renewed love for this amazing rectangle of green in the heart of the big city. Its startlingly lush woodlands and rolling lawns, its meandering trails and wide open meadows, and of course, its astonishing wildlife, including owls. Here is the very snowy owl. Hawks, herons, and a dizzying array of other birds, who for generations have used Central Park as a vital rest stop in their migratory travels, knowing what many humans only came to fully appreciate during the uncertainties of the pandemic, that the park is a beautiful and essential sanctuary. And I sometimes catch myself right at this point and think that, gee, if I had been the copy editor or the supervising editor of the opinion pages of the New York Times, I would have bolded that one word, essential sanctuary. It's not an optional amenity. These parks are essential amenities. Amenity is not the right word, is it? Just to give you a sense of the path that brought me to this film project, it wasn't really quite referenced, but I originated and co-produced the 2014 PBS special Frederick Law Olmsted Designing America, which has broadcast across the country and has had repeats broadcast regionally and multiple screenings across the country. So there's a long story, but just to give you a sense of the path that brought me to the film project when I was young, I would visit the house of my maternal grandparents very near Boston's Franklin Park. As an adult, I would regularly walk along along Olmsted's Back Bay Fens and Fenway to visit the famous art museums of the area. I would jog around the Jamaica Pond and botanize and stroll around the Olmsted-designed Harvard Arnold Arboretum. As many of you know, all of those parks are integrated into Boston's famed Emerald Necklace, a crescent of Olmsted-designed parks and parkways that wind around a major portion of the city of Boston. I would eventually, of course, visit Central Park and eventually come across this, Prospect Park. And the first time I entered through Endale Arch, as you see here, and looked down the expanse of the long meadow in Prospect Park in Brooklyn, tears welled up in my eyes as I was simply overwhelmed by its sheer beauty and utter perfection. And this was decades before it occurred to me to develop and produce a film about Mr. Olmsted and his legacy. Perhaps some of you saw our film. There's the DVD cover. I learned very shortly after moving to Portland, Oregon, some 30 years ago, that the entire park system where I am here was master planned by the stepson, John Charles. And after completion of a prior film, I approached an old friend back in Massachusetts, Laurence Cotton, and we developed this film together, and it did air nationwide on PBS in 2014. So in the years since then, I've continued to dig into the Olmsted archives, meet with scholars and practitioners, explore additional Olmsted landscapes, as well as revisit some favorite locations. So allow me to summarize some of the salient content of the film, but also expand upon it a little and share some of my gleanings with you. His early years in brief. Frederick Law Olmsted's life began in 1822 as the first son of successful merchant John Olmsted of Hartford, Connecticut. As a youth, Olmsted roamed his native Connecticut landscape, as you see depicted in this picture here, initially in his father's saddle on rides through the New England countryside. All of the biographers and astute commentators tell us that it was that kind of early contemplative immersion into the rural country landscape that would have a lasting impact on the young man, as did his walks, his solitary rambles, and occasional long walks, as when he and his brother trekked from Hartford, downtown Hartford, to their aunt's house some 16 miles away, a walk that would actually take those two young boys, 2 days of time. Young Frederick attended several boarding schools in Connecticut, but he had to abandon plans for college due to weak eyesight. He briefly worked for a New York City dry goods importing firm, but the young man was captured by the romance of life at sea, and in 1843 he set out for China as an apprentice seaman. Thus, Olmsted had his year before the mast, if you will, as a seaman sailing to China and back. Though the younger brother, John Hull Olmsted, did manage to matriculate at Yale, not Fred. However, he did spend a great deal of time in the company of other Yaleys. And here's a portrait of that group of men at Yale with his brother and chums. Olmsted's right in front. Here's his brother behind him. And Olmsted's right arm is around the shoulder of Charles Loring Brace, who became a prominent social reformer who influenced Olmsted's ideas and career. In 1846, Olmsted began to explore career, in fact, as a scientific farmer, a field that was on the rise. He apprenticed first at a model farm near Syracuse, New York, and then he farmed at Satcham's Head on the Connecticut shore. That didn't work out. Subsequently, he bought a larger property on Staten Island, Tosamook Farm, and there made some improvements there. Here's Olmsted's sketch of the farm below, and that's an early 20th century photograph, unless I'm mistaken, up above of Tosamook Farm. It's there that Olmsted made improvements. He started experimenting with drainage techniques, something that he became fascinated with and arguably specialized in early in his career. The property, by the way, is now was recently placed on the State Historic Register, and it's now known as the Olmsted Beale House. I don't yet have a picture here for you, but in 1850, Frederick traveled to Europe and the British Isles in the company of his brother, John Hull Olmsted. Also in 1850, he was hired by the New York Times to tour the South and file reports from the field. More about that in a little bit. In 1855, Olmsted became a partner in the firm that published the popular Putnam's Monthly magazine. That business failed in 1857. But that same year, Olmsted's first book about the South, A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States, was published. 1857 was a momentous year in Olmsted's life. He was appointed the first superintendent of Central Park, and it is after that that he and English-born architect Calvert Vaux collaborated on the winning design for the park called Greensward. And with that success, Olmsted was appointed architect-in-chief for Central Park. This is the characteristic image we see of him with cape and hat on. In 1859, Frederick marries Mary Cleveland Perkins Olmsted, his brother's widow, formally adopted her children, raising them as his own. In 1861, Olmsted was appointed General Secretary of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, a Civil War-era national medical relief effort securing aid and supplies for wounded soldiers. More on that in a minute, too. After resigning his appointment with the Sanitary Commission, Olmsted was appointed commissioner of the Olmsted and Mariposa mining estates. He moved his entire family to the Sierra Nevada. There's this roughneck mining town of Mariposa, California, circa 1860. There, Olmsted managed a gold mine and was appointed to the California State Commission and played a leadership role in writing the first report proposing the permanent protection of Yosemite Valley. More about that report a little later. In 1864, Olmsted was reappointed landscape architect for Central Park, and with Calvert Vaux, here's a picture, I'm sorry, I still need to catch up with myself. There's a picture of Olmsted with his family picnicking in the Mariposa Grove when they're there, when he's working at managing the gold mine. And here's another picture of Yosemite Valley. Nice historic lithograph. Sometimes I get ahead of myself. Good. And now, finally, he returns to New York at the urging of Calvert Vaux, and they start working on Prospect Park in Brooklyn. And on Broadway in Manhattan, Olmsted and Vaux opened the first office of landscape architecture practice in the United States. Now, over the course of his life, Olmsted experienced considerable family tragedy, early deaths of mother, brother, and children, his own near death in a terrible carriage accident in Central Park that left him maimed for life, and was plagued by a nearly lifelong struggle with dark depression and a host of other physical ailments toward the end of his life. Yet, even then, fighting infirmities and utter exhaustion, he was still designing the landscape for the 1893 World Columbian Exposition in Chicago and the grounds of the Biltmore Estate, and supervising the creation of these, his final masterpieces. Now, let's review certain aspects of that career, or perhaps we should say his careers, plural, his manifold roles as scientific farmer, social reformer, capable administrator, writer, editor, and literary publisher, landscape designer, and park builder. Frederick Law Olmsted was first and foremost a social reformer, and his career was central to the social reform movement in the U.S. during the second half of the 19th century. Olmsted was a philosopher of democracy. He read widely and deeply and wrote thoughtfully about the subject, and manifested it in his philosophy of park design and in his actual park creations. This is what Olmsted had to say about Central Park, and this is a nice picture of the sheep meadow in Central Park when it reopened just coming out of COVID in the spring of 2021. Olmsted. In Central Park, you will find all classes largely represented with a common purpose, each individual adding by his mere presence to the pleasure of all others, all helping to the greater happiness of each. You often see vast numbers of persons brought closely together, poor and rich, young and old. As one of the commentators in our film, historian Keith Morgan, said, quote, Olmsted intensely believed in democracy and the park as a site for the enactment of democracy, unquote. In fact, some scholars have argued that Central Park was Olmsted's response to what he witnessed in the South and to the Civil War, that the great park in the North would provide a counterpoint as a welcoming democratic space where anyone could gather, regardless of origin or background. Yes, by the way, in case you're wondering, I am aware that work on Central Park began before the Civil War broke out. But remember, Olmsted and Vaux continued to work on Central Park and Prospect Park for years after the end of the war. Though he strayed away from describing himself as such, he was indeed an artist. As is stated by historian Sarah Cedar Miller in our film, Central Park was arguably the most important piece of American art in the 19th century. She says that loudly and clearly. Clearly, it was the most monumental in scale. Author and Olmsted expert Elizabeth Barlow Rogers, founder of the Central Park Conservancy, she had this to say about Central Park in our film. Quote, it is a triumph of 19th century engineering, a symphonic sequence of beautiful spaces, unquote. I love that phrase, a symphonic sequence of beautiful spaces. And this is how I like to capture it. What the Hudson River School painters were doing with pigment and brush in 2 dimensions on canvas, Olmsted early on in collaboration with Calvert Vaux, was drawing, painting, and sculpting the landscapes of our great cities while working not in 2, not in 3, but in 4 dimensions. What is the 4th dimension, anyone? I think you all know what it is: time. In Olmsted's own words, I have all my life been considering distant effects and always sacrificing immediate success and applause to that of the future. In laying out Central Park, we've determined to think of no results to be realized in less than 40 years. Now, I have to tell you, this is, of course, the very famous painting by Thomas Cole, considered the founder of the Hudson River School, and most people call it the Oxbow, but the official title is After a Thunderstorm. And by the way, there is an artist with that's Thomas Cole, presumably, with an easel in the landscape. This very setting is still here today. I think both Michael and Susan know it. Some of you on this virtual audience probably know it. I attended college just a few miles north of here. This is Mount Holyoke, overlooking the Oxbow of the Connecticut River. Now, I don't have time to do a deep dive into landscape design theory or landscape history. Let me simply say that as a landscape designer, Olmsted was influenced by those who came before him, practitioners of garden design and deep thinkers in the realm of art, such as John Ruskin. But in particular, I want to mention a couple of great English landscape designers. You could also call them garden designers of the day: Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton. Also, in the United States, we have to give a nod to Andrew Jackson Downing, who was so influential at mid-19th century in America. And of course, Fox worked with Downing. Olmsted certainly knew him. We know for a fact they knew each other quite well. And Downing, in fact, would have most definitely have been appointed the first architect-in-chief or designer of Central Park if it weren't for the fact that he died prematurely in a tragic steamboat accident on the Hudson River. But I want to offer a shorthand. We could do a whole seminar, and it's been done. Certainly, the Olmsted Network has supported such seminars that touch on the aspects of the sublime, the pastoral, and the picturesque in the Olmsted design philosophy. I'm just going to demonstrate in shorthand. Real shorthand. Olmsted incorporated aspects of the pastoral and the picturesque in all of his masterworks. Picture the contrast between the sheep's meadow. Here's the sheep meadow: open, sunlit, wide expanse, place for people to gather and congregate, with trees on the fringe, beautiful plantings of trees, of course. But, a short transition away, I think it's no more than about a third of a mile, is the ramble. From the sheep meadow to the ramble. The ramble, of course, is the picturesque spot in the park. It's the birding hotspot. Narrow, curvilinear trails, closed-in trees, burbling water feature. It has all of those aspects, and all of the Olmsted masterworks, and those of his sons and others that followed often have these transitions: the sunlit open space, the pastoral to the picturesque, just as you see depicted here. As builder of Central Park, Olmsted successfully managed thousands of men in one of the largest construction projects to that point in time of America. During the Civil War, as director of the Sanitary Commission, the forerunner to the Red Cross, Olmsted perfected his management skills while heading up a huge supply of medical relief and field hospital outfit, including, by the way, managing a veritable armada, a fleet of hospital ships during that time. This is one such hospital ship on the Mississippi. Olmsted reorganized the Army Medical Corps, coordinated contributions and volunteers from local aid societies. During that time, by the way, the Sanitary Commission was the nation's largest national public health initiative up until that time. And sanitary fairs were held in the major cities of the North. Here's an image of one such fair in Philadelphia. And a number of that generation of women's leaders were involved in raising funds at the sanitary fairs to support the work of the commission. Here is one, Catherine Prescott Wormley, and she was a nurse who actually worked in the field side by side with Olmsted during the Civil War. And here's a picture of a sanitary commission hospital at the Battle of Gettysburg, 1863. What about his writings, Olmsted's writings? He published a travelogue and a reflective series of essays in the volume Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England. There's the original on the left. You too can buy that very copy on the right. Later, reflecting on his travels to Europe, Olmsted wrote, quote, "While others gravitated to pictures, architecture, the Alps, libraries, high life and low life when traveling, I had gravitated to parks." It was at that point, particularly while exploring the English countryside, that Olmsted was working out what overarching landscape design concepts he thought best to apply to American soil. and by doing so to enhance the public park experience for everyone, not just the wealthy elite. Olmsted was particularly inspired by England's very first public park, Birkenhead Park, near Liverpool, designed by Joseph Paxton. And Olmsted noted, quote, that the poorest British peasant is free to enjoy it in all its parts, as is the British Queen, unquote. Before then, only the lords and ladies could enjoy their vast private estates or hunting grounds. And in the US, though, without the same hardened class system as was in place in England at the time, the common person did not have access to parks at this time. Only the wealthy had access to their estates and small private parks in places such as Manhattan. On another front, the literary republic, Olmsted's 3 volumes about his journeys in the South and the plains throughout the slave states, through frontier Texas, by the way, where he was amazed by the communitarian aspects of the German immigrant settlement, so tidy, so neat, and carrying out real community-based democracy. He was the later version of this. All these volumes had a lasting impact. They're still in print, but it was consolidated, the later version, as the Cotton Kingdom. It's still widely available. And here is Olmsted's map of the Cotton Kingdom. Olmsted's journalistic career started when he was hired by the early iteration of the New York Daily Times, as it was called, as a roaming correspondent in what seemed to be a foreign land, the antebellum South. As far as Northerners were concerned, it was a foreign land. When the first book was published in England, it had a significant impact on the intelligentsia, and it helped sway British public opinion away from supporting the Confederacy toward the Union side. In fact, this book also was cited by none other than Charles Darwin as influential in his thinking about race as he was preparing The Origin of Species for publication. When I say this book, I'm referring to the Cotton Kingdom. Plus, the same text left its mark on the young Malcolm X in prison, hungrily reading and feeding his mind as he was maturing in his political thought. In addition to his stint as publisher and co-editor for Putnam's Monthly, Olmsted co-founded The Nation magazine and played a key role as editor of that publication in its early years. By the way, the longest running publication of its kind in America, of, if you will, liberal public opinion. And during this relatively brief period in his career, Olmsted befriended and published some of the prominent writers and intellectuals of the day. To name but a few, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Let's go in clockwise, starting at the top left. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Herman Melville, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Well, other prominent writers could be added to that list. Additionally, Olmsted had contact with some key painters of the Hudson River School, notably his distant cousin from Hartford, Frederick Edwin Church, so famous for this bravura landscape of Niagara Falls. Well, I could go on, you get the point. Between Putnam's Monthly and The Nation, through his social circle and ties to the cultural leadership, his contacts were a veritable who's who of the arts and letters of America during this era. And to that list can be added many of the leading social reformers of the day. Read the literature out there, read the biographies, and you will come across a litany of men and women of letters, cultural celebrities, and political leaders, many of whom today we would call influencers. And by the way, as I've been rereading some of the literature again recently, I've decided that at this point in time in 19th century America, Olmsted was arguably one of the influencers in chief, if you don't mind me using that phrase. It's important to understand the origins of the public park movement in North America. In the highly polluted cities of the 19th century, the trees, shrubs, and lawns in parks served as famously the lungs of the city, creating refuges of fresh air. Park advocates argued that parks provided refined imitations of nature, claiming that exposure to them would improve people's character, regardless of their socioeconomic status. Andrew Jackson Downing himself wrote this in 1848. Quote, "Parks will be better preachers of temperance than temperance societies, better refiners of national manners than dancing schools, and better promoters of general good feeling than any lectures on the philosophy of happiness." Unquote. Pretty well said for the 19th century. Sentiments like that reflect the influence of the Romantics on the New World's attitudes towards nature. What had once been seen as something separate from humans, to be conquered and feared, became something humans were a part of, that they could turn to for restoration. Downing and Olmsted brought their experiences of touring European gardens to the US, further emphasizing the beneficial relationship between humans and nature and democratizing the public park experience. Before Central Park, by the way, the principal place for New Yorkers to walk in nature were along the paths of here's Downing and here's the Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. And by the way, it was well-heeled New Yorkers who perambulated in their carriages after Sunday church services in the Greenwood Cemetery. It wasn't the commoners. They weren't they were a little intimidated to be seen in this spot. They had literally no place to go until Central Park. And I should emphasize that parks were absolutely seen as instruments for public health. In the mid-19th century, New York and all cities were still dealing with outbreaks of cholera and other diseases. In fact, Frederick Law and Mary Olmsted lost their first child due to an outbreak of cholera. Though the epidemiology of such diseases was imperfectly understood at the time, indeed, Central Park served as the famous lungs of the city. In their argument supporting the design for Central Park, Olmsted and his collaborator Vaux wrote this in 1868. Bear with me, it's a little bit of a longer extract. Quote, "There is no doubt that the more intense intellectual activity, which prevails equally in the library, the workshop, and the counting room, makes tranquilizing recreation more essential to continued health and strength. Civilized men are growing more and more subject to insidious enemies to their health and happiness, and against these the remedy cannot be found in medicine or in athletic recreations, but only in sunlight and such forms of gentle exercise as are calculated to equalize the circulation and relieve the brain." Unquote. Now, it's somewhat archaic language, and you may not entirely agree with their case for passive versus active recreation. Let's give you a picture of Central Park while we're talking about this. But you could see that in essence, Olmsted and Vaux were proponents of what could be called forest bathing, a concept that's of course much in vogue now. The modern version of it, I suppose, originated in Japan. But I think it's pretty easy to say that Henry David Thoreau, Frederick Law Olmsted, and John Muir were the principal early proponents of forest bathing in 19th century in America. And it does give us pause, though, at a time like this, when we see people, so many people wandering around the outdoors with a soundtrack continuously beaming in their ears, or worse, not observing the natural world, but rather looking down with their eyes entranced by their shimmering screens, like this trio on a park bench. Now, we're all at fault for that. We all occasionally indulge in this, but it does give you pause. Is that fully experiencing nature? I do not believe so. I could talk about many of the delightful discoveries in the making of our film. One was Buffalo. I'm going to zoom through this quick for the sake of time, but I do want to point out some things about Buffalo. Oh, first, Prospect Park. Olmsted and Vaux actually considered it their masterpiece, and most people in the Olmsted scholarship world still consider Prospect Park maybe the superior park to Central Park, as it was, they didn't have to make as many compromises with their design. There was minimal political intrusion and fiscal interference. So we have to give some pride of place to Prospect Park. And here is Endale Arch, by the way. Look at the bottom image. Look at how gorgeous it is. That's the restored Endale Arch. There's the before and the after. Look at that. Please, everyone, go to the Grand Aubrey Plaza entrance and walk through the new restored Endale Arch so that you can take in the expanse of the Long Meadow at Prospect Park. Extraordinary. And the Back Bay Fens, by the way, I had intended actually to hide these slides, but since I'm showing it to you, Back Bay Fens, this is the first true wetlands restoration project in the history of the United States. There it is again, and this is what it looks like. These were the public sewers for the city of Boston, and Olmsted transformed them into this, as if they always had been there. Not so, not so. First wetland restoration project in the history of the United States in downtown Boston. And then there's the Buffalo Park System, the first integrated park system ever built in the United States. You can see the parks and the parkways with traffic circles. Let me give you some close-ups. Delaware Park and Front Park. Here's the parkways, the historic. It's actually, they keep getting switched on me, those slides, but it's Lincoln actually now on the right. It's historic Lincoln Park on the right and Bidwell on the left. But the famous parkways of Buffalo, where Olmsted and Vaux literally invented the parkway. And you can see these parkways are not narrow green strips, far from it. They're wide green linear parks with various modes of pathways built on them for pedestrians, and in this on the right, of course, horseback. Now, okay, let's oh, and before I give off, arguably the Buffalo Park System is arguably the most authentic of its kind in America. And it's certainly first and foremost as the first integrated park system of its kind in America that Olmsted and Vaux worked on together. But before I go on, I don't want to cause any offense to my friends in Louisville and Boston. Certainly those park systems there extended many partite, if you will, Olmsted Park systems in Louisville and Boston are par excellence, and they're right up there with Buffalo as the primo Olmsted Park systems in the United States to this day. Now, a few additional notes about some of Olmsted's guiding principles. After his experiences touring and writing about the conditions of the American South, Olmsted wrote this in the New York Times, quote, government should strive to exert an elevating experience upon all people and promote public parks and gardens, galleries of art and instruction in art, music, athletic sports, and healthful recreations, and other means of cultivating taste and lessening the excessive materialism, a purpose in which we are, as a people, so cursedly absorbed. Well, scholars have noted, and I have to chime in here, it seems to me that in this passage, Olmsted laid out not only the role for public financing of parks, but also public support for libraries, the arts, and humanities, all under attack at this time. In his oft-cited 1880 paper he delivered to the American Social Science Association, Olmsted wrote about how he saw visitors to Central Park as, quote, coming together with a common purpose, not at all intellectual, competitive with none, disposing to jealousy and spiritual or intellectual pride toward none, each individual adding by his mere presence to the pleasure of all others, all helping to the greater happiness of each, unquote. With regards to the history of Yosemite Park, a little more detail is in order for the purposes of this program. Truth be told, it is worth reading this entire 1865 report for its precious wording and prescient wording. He wrote it, of course, for the state of California. There is considerable background detail in two recent books that I will commend at the end of this program. Perhaps Olmsted took a cue from the Hudson River School painter Thomas Cole, who wrote, quote, the country is endowed with features unknown to Europe. The most distinctive and perhaps most impressive characteristic of American scenery is its wildness, unquote. That's Thomas Cole. As a leading member of the Yosemite Commission, that is the Yosemite Mariposa Tract was donated by the federal government to the state of California in 1864, Olmsted and his fellow commissioners were directed to provide advice to California. And in this report, Olmsted wrote, here's a famous one of many famous Carlton Watkins historic images of Yosemite Valley dated 1865. Olmsted wrote in this report, it is the main duty of government to provide means of protection for all its citizens in the pursuit of happiness against the obstacles which the selfishness of individuals is liable to interpose to that pursuit. And I like the way scholar Dennis Drabell describes this very moment in his book that I will cite soon. And I'm quoting from Dennis Drabell's book about Yosemite. The specific pursuit of happiness that Olmsted had in mind here when he wrote this report was the enjoyment of secluded fresh air retreats. And by borrowing that phrase from the Declaration of Independence, he was in effect taking the Declaration out for a walk in the wilds. He viewed park and the recreation to which they lend themselves as de rigueur for a thoughtful and inclusive democracy. As with Central Park, Olmsted wanted to find a way to ensure that all, regardless of means, would have access to the healing power of nature. In urban settings and the equivalent of a near wilderness park like Yosemite, Olmsted knew that the upper classes had access to fresh air and the benefits to physical and mental health provided by outdoor activity in a green environment such as a park. But he was concerned that the working class, often living in crowded, unsanitary conditions, this applies more to urban parks, of course, did not have equal access to similar relief. Thus, Olmsted wrote, quote, the establishment by government of great public grounds for the free enjoyment of the people is thus justified and enforced as a political duty, unquote. I almost feel as if Olmsted is even channeling Abe Lincoln here as well. It's important to note that in the case of Yosemite, Olmsted set the model for minimal intrusion of infrastructure, that but few roads and public amenities should impede the experience of magnificent scenery and pristine nature. Samuel Bowles, the publisher of the influential newspaper The Springfield Republican and a key Olmsted ally, foresaw that the type of large nature park proposed by Olmsted in his Yosemite report would become a model for other such parks across America. In the meantime, Yellowstone, of course, would become America's first national park in 1872, and it wasn't until 1906 that Teddy Roosevelt signed the law creating Yosemite National Park. And many people in our audience know they're going to say, wait a minute, what about so-and-so? Well, there were other key personalities who played their own roles in urging the protection of Yosemite Valley and the surrounding mountain scenery, and of course, and the creation of a national park there, notably, of course, John Muir. There's a somewhat similar story concerning Niagara Falls, which have become a mix of ugly industries and shoddy tourist traps. But for lack of time, I'll only say that starting in 1869, a national and binational, meaning the US and Canada, and eventually international campaign led by Olmsted, key New York State allies, and a host of other luminaries, including some of the leading writers or influencers of the day in the US, Canada, and England, eventually led New York State and Canada to protect both sides of Niagara Falls. You have to, thus you have the Niagara Falls State Reservation designed by Olmsted and Vaux. But a little background is in order here too. In the 1860s at Yosemite, Olmsted had advanced the theory that a republic had the responsibility to protect scenic beauty. And in the 1870s, Olmsted put theory into practice at the highly degraded industrial site of Niagara Falls that you see before you here. Campaigners to restore and protect the falls formed the Niagara Falls Association. It amounted to the first big national campaign for scenic preservation. And as the result, on April 30th, 1885, the New York governor signed a bill creating the first state park in the nation, the Niagara Falls State Reservation, New York State Reservation. And speaking of which, I was paying attention to the dates. I assume just a week ago, the 140th anniversary of this moment was commemorated at Niagara Falls last week, I would have to assume. Olmsted and Vaux were commissioned to master plan this new park. And I entirely agree with the commentary in our film. Here is the Free Niagara movement. And here is the master plan for Goat Island, their special pride of place landscape there at Niagara Falls complex. The comments are in our film, but go out to Goat Island, landscape by Olmsted and Vaux. Surround yourself with those stunning rapids. Here's the bridge to the falls. Here's the subsequent bridge that leads further out to the the Three Sisters Islands. And go out there above the falls with the mist rising and the roar of the falls below. It's a rich visual and oral, meaning hearing experience. Let's talk briefly about the elder of the two sons. He apprenticed, of course, he graduated from Yale, apprenticed with his dad, worked in the father's office at Fairstead, now the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site in Brookline, Massachusetts. He first worked, he apprenticed, he actually managed the Olmsted Brothers' work at various places, including notably Essex County, the first county-wide park system in the United States. This is Branch Brook Park with the cherry blossoms blooming in downtown Newark, an extraordinarily beautiful park. If you haven't been there, check out Branch Brook Park someday, even at any time of year, even when the cherry blossoms are not there. John Charles also worked in Atlanta, Louisville, and the Chicago park system. He left a huge mark in the Pacific Northwest. He came out here. These are Douglas fir overlooking Puget Sound. He was struck by the vistas, including distant mountains. There's Mount Rainier looming above early 20th century downtown Seattle. He came to Portland, he designed the master plan, the 1905 Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition, to put Portland on the map. He did the same thing in 1909, the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition of 1909, the AYP. Notice the view shed here. This is Drumheller Fountain, and this is Fountain. This is the view from the centerpiece of the exposition grounds, and this becomes the centerpiece of the modern-day University of Washington campus. There is the Drumheller Fountain, there's the beautiful view shed, and there's Mount Rainier to the southeast. Olmsted also to 35 parks connected by parkways. Does this remind you of a prior plan I showed of Buffalo? Of course it is. So this is, again, John Charles Olmsted, the most significant park system of its kind in the Pacific Northwest, 35 parks connected by parkways in Seattle. Excuse me. And here is Volunteer Park. This is I like vintage postcards. This is a vintage postcard of Volunteer Park, which is often pointed to as the most perfect Olmsted Park in Seattle. There are many more. Here is Green Lake Park. Here is the Washington Park Arboretum, but a few. And where I'm speaking to you from today, this is Laurelhurst Park. Isn't that beautiful? Again, an Olmsted master plan park system here in Portland. I'm not going to take much time to talk about my own neighborhood parks, but I'll point out this. This is Forest Park. Isn't this magnificent? Forest Park. It is the one of the largest urban wilderness parks of its kind in the United States. Olmsted, that's John Charles, told the city leaders, protect it. Don't allow it to be developed. It remains protected to this day. Nearly 6,000 acres. Here is downtown Portland to the southeast of this huge protected urban forest reserve overlooking the city. And it's riddled with trails and beautiful contemporary bridges on some of the trails. It's really quite lovely. Let's move to the son before I bring this to a close, the other son, the youngest son. But before I talk about Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., I want to talk a little bit about the City Beautiful movement. And I'm going to do that by starting with once again, the World's Columbian Exposition, the White City, Chicago World's Fair, 1893. There, Olmsted Sr. developed his ideas for planning a comprehensive system of parks, shaping the land to create spaces that seemed natural, but had in fact been highly designed to achieve a particular effect. Olmsted Sr. believed that cities could be improved through the application of the principles of landscape architecture. In a democracy, Olmsted argued, the health of the republic relied on the civic health of the voting population, and that public parks, in and of themselves, could enhance the civic strength of a community. I show you Lake Park in Milwaukee because it's one of my favorites. It's outstanding, and it's considered a perfect exemplar of the City Beautiful era in park building. And of course, this is Olmsted Sr., another citywide Olmsted Park system in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Planning with a comprehensive view was a new idea in North American cities. Up until then, cities often grew in a haphazard fashion. As the 19th century progressed, the idea of guiding city development to improve living conditions and promote economic development gained currency. What would become the City Beautiful movement had its roots, in fact, in that World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. And the director of that fair, make no little plans, Daniel Burnham, used the exposition to showcase how architecture, landscape design, and plan development could create the White City, a beautiful, orderly, functional space that contrasted sharply with the many chaotic and disorderly urban areas, including very nearby in Chicago at that time. Now, I fully realize that the White City was a temporary stage set, a folly and a utopian fantasy, but it did set something significant in motion, including what would become known as the Macmillan Plan for Washington, D.C. So let's return to his namesake, Olmsted Sr.'s namesake, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., often referred to as Rick, the younger brother who was brought into the family practice and left a huge imprint across America from coast to coast and from north to south. From his youngest years, he was aware of his father's interest in having him follow in his footsteps. He graduated from Harvard, where he had studied botany and horticulture in a way in depth that the father had never had a chance to pursue academically. In the waning years of his life, the father included his son in the culminating projects of his career. In fact, still a student at Harvard, young Jr. was working on the White City of the World's Columbian Exposition. And after graduating in 1894, he spent a year on site at Biltmore, the 100,000 acre estate being developed for George Vanderbilt in Asheville, North Carolina. Following his father's formal retirement in 1897, he became a full partner with his half-brother John Charles in the family business. And here is that family business, Fairstead. Both sons, by the way, and others of the time, including Beatrix Farrand, played a role in launching the ASLA, the American Society of Landscape Architecture. Jr. also helped establish and taught at the first professional landscape architecture program in the nation at Harvard. He emerged on the national scene in 1901 when he was appointed to the Commission of Fine Arts for the District of Columbia, known commonly as the Macmillan Commission. And there he worked with his father's colleagues, in fact, still living from the Chicago World's Fair, to transform Washington into a work of civic art and to devise a comprehensive plan for its future development. And a partial listing of Junior's projects in the nation's capital reads like a guide to Washington, D.C., including the National Mall, the Jefferson Memorial, Roosevelt Island, the National Cathedral grounds, the National Zoo, the White House grounds, here indicated as the Executive Mansion, and Rock Creek Park and Parkway. And by the way, speaking of the nation's capital, I do want to remind you that Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. also left his mark there. He did extensive landscaping work on the U.S. Capitol grounds, including reorienting the entrance and designing and seeing to the installation of the Capitol steps. I repeat that, the Capitol steps. Remember, Olmsted Sr. saw all his public commissions as public spaces where Americans would enact democracy. And I wonder if what occurred there on January 6th with those crowds assaulting the Capitol I wonder if that was Mr. Olmsted's notion of the enactment of democracy. You might remember that the National Park Service celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2016. In fact, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. played a key role in writing the Organic Act of 1916. There is the father's report on the Yosemite Valley. And here is the wording from the Organic Act of 1916, the founding legislation, the authorizing legislation for our National Park Service, written by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. to conserve the scenery and the natural and historic objects and the wildlife therein, and to provide for the enjoyment of the same in such manner and by such means that will leave them unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. Like father, like son. For 30 years, Junior, Rick Olmsted, advised the National Park Service on issues of management and the conservation of scenic resources. He left his mark on national parks, and the Olmsted Brothers firm left their mark on national parks from coast to coast, including Maine's Acadia National Park, the Florida Everglades, the Great Smoky Mountains, and Yosemite. And by the way, in his later years, Junior actively worked for the protection of California's coastal redwoods and lived to see the Redwood National Park's Olmsted Grove dedicated in his honor. And here, why not finally give you a beautiful picture of Yosemite, majestically beautiful Yosemite Valley. Now, I'm going to speed through the rest so we can bring this to a close. Let's not forget, again, all of the residential developments that were worked on by all of the Olmsteds, starting with Olmsted Sr. at Riverside, Illinois. Junior worked on other commissions on the East Coast. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things that are among my favorites. Denver has a regional park system that is something to behold. The Denver Mountain Park System, all master planned by the Olmsted brothers under Junior's leadership. Here is the most famous of them all, with its own resident bison herd. They're still there to this day. There's Chief Hosa Lodge and the bison herd at Genesee Park, the oldest and largest of the Denver Mountain Park systems. I'm not going to show you all of them, again, for lack of time. Some of you certainly know of the Red Rocks Amphitheater. Where is it? In Red Rocks Park. Where is Red Rocks Park? It's part of the Denver Mountain Park system on the outskirts of Denver. Although I have to tell you, Red Rocks Park was added subsequently. It wasn't part of the original Olmsted master plan. It was a subsequent addition. And let's go to California quickly. I wanted to highlight a few things. This is one of the father's principal projects, Mountain View Cemetery in Oakland, California. There is what it looks like today. It's a gorgeous, if you will, rural cemetery in an urban setting on the East Bay. Stanford University. We haven't even touched on universities. They are legion. The Olmsted father and sons and Olmsted Brothers firm, their projects in university campuses across America is astounding. One of the most famous, of course, is Stanford, which was an active collaboration between Leland Stanford, the client, and Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. But it resulted in an architecture and landscape plan of some brilliance and cohesiveness, which is renowned to this day for exactly that, its cohesiveness and its beauty. And there's a few views of the Stanford campus. Later in the 20th century, Junior was active on the East Hills of Berkeley, and he saw these beautiful East Hills, which the locals wanted to protect and develop to a certain extent into some parklands. Well, he sure did that. He created a regional park system. Here is the, I think, first and most historic Tilden Regional Park, but it is now an it's now a heavily utilized system with countless parks on the East Bay. It's just extraordinary how many parks there are there in the East Bay that all go back to the original Olmsted master plan. And here is a map of all those parks, some of which, of course, were added after the original Olmsted Junior master plan. But look at that extensive regional park system in the East Bay. He did the same thing for the California State Park system twice over. In fact, Olmsted Junior master planned the California State Park system. And part of that master plan, he said, you have to protect those redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains, which of course were badly impacted in recent fires in recent years. He also said you have to protect the desert, and the largest desert park in the state of California, state park that is the Anza Borrego Desert. There it is under full bloom. And the Palos Verdes Estates, but I'm going to move ahead. And I want to talk a little bit before I bring this to the close about what did go on at Biltmore, because it's an interesting story in terms of the history of forestry in the United States. It's not so much about the estate, folks, although the estate is gorgeous, meaning the house, the elaborate, the most beautiful private home ever built, certainly the largest in America, with its magnificent gardens. But it was the entire estate, 125,000 acres initially. And Olmsted Sr. was there to work in the gardens, make improvements to the grounds. Look at the degraded grounds as they existed when Vanderbilt first bought the estate. It was really a terrible shape. And Olmsted made extraordinary improvements. There's the view from the Biltmore house today across the estate. But here's the key. He convinced George Vanderbilt to hire a young scientific forester by the name of Gifford Pinchot to manage this as the first scientifically managed plot of forest land in America. And he did. And Gifford Pinchot made some considerable improvements to the Biltmore Woods. There's the before and after. And then he went off to hire calling with the U.S. Forest Service in Washington. And he said, I know a German forester that needs to take my place. His name is Carl Schenck. Well, Carl Schenck created the first forestry school to ever operate in America on the grounds of the Biltmore estate. There it is, where they trained some 300 foresters in the early days of American forestry. And now the majority of the estate was donated by Vanderbilt's widow in the early 20th century and is now the Pisgah National Forest. And there's the Cradle of Forestry, where the site of the original Carl Schenck Forestry School, there in the heart of the Pisgah National Forest. And here's the Cradle of Forestry overlook. Very beautiful, well worth visiting if you ever go to that part of the country. Let's see, I want to flash by. This is Druid Hills in Atlanta, the Olmsted Linear Park in Atlanta, another extraordinary site worth visiting if you're in Atlanta. Let's not forget that there's an entire park system created for the city of Birmingham by the Olmsted Brothers. And let's go quickly to Florida. I know we have at least one guest with us from Florida today. Here's Memorial Park in Jacksonville. That's Olmsted Sr. And here's John Nolan, the great urban planner who studied with Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. And John Nolan, among other things, produced a marvelous plan for the city of Venice, Florida. The entire place was master planned. The entire city, a modern day city of Venice, Florida, was master planned by an Olmsted acolyte, an Olmsted mentored individual, John Nolan, considered one of the deans of American urban planning. Now, there's another place in Central Florida referred to as the Lake Wales Ridge. And first, the Olmsted brothers were brought in, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., to master plan a private residential compound. It's now a gated community called Mountain Lake Estates. But one of the residents was Edward Bok, of Ladies' Home Journal publishing fame. And he told Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., I'm gonna buy that hill up above here. I want you to convert it into a bird sanctuary. Well, Olmsted outdid him. They added acres to the estate. They created Bok Tower Gardens, which is the jewel of Olmsted designed botanical gardens in the entire state of Florida, arguably one of the jewels of any of the Olmsted botanical gardens anywhere in the United States, always being improved, always with a significant support base there in Lake Wales. Here, I'm just showing you some pictures of the paths. And there is the Singing Tower, the famous Singing Tower, and the Lily Pond at Bok Tower Gardens. And I'm closing finally. So during the past few years of social distancing, public parks have been a lifesaver for so many of us seeking fresh air, exercise, physical and psychological health, and doing so safely. Frederick Law Olmsted now appears so entirely prescient, as for one, he emphasized the public health, mental health, and taking it even further, the spiritual health benefits of the public park experience for everyone in a democracy. Though Olmsted did not utilize terms so common in our vocabulary today, terms such as equity and access. However, if one reads his writings, you could argue that he cared deeply about those issues. And the Olmsted landscape design legacy that we highlight plays an ever more crucial role, highlights the fact that the ever more crucial role that the public park experience plays in our lives. Needless to say, COVID and social and environmental justice movements have only greatly underlined that very fact, and the urgent need to provide more green space, to distribute it equitably, and to make such spaces accessible and inviting to all. In fact, it isn't too much of a stretch to say that that was Frederick Law Olmsted's agenda from the very start. A couple of quotes to leave you with. Fay Harwell, landscape architect, Olmsted scholar, had this to say at the close of our film. Quote, Sometimes we don't even know that we've been experiencing an Olmsted Park. If you think of those tiny little experiences multiplied over all of those thousands of parks, this is really a huge, huge impact on human experience in America. Olmsted ally and influential critic Charles Eliot Norton had this to say about his friend, quote, "Of all American artists, he stands first in the production of great works which answer the needs and give expression to the life of our immense and miscellaneous democracy," unquote. And I'll close with this. Finally, in Olmsted's own words, "The beauty of the park should be in the beauty of the fields, the meadow, the prairie, of the green pastures and the still waters. What we want to gain is tranquility and rest to the mind. Is it doubtful that it does men good to come together this way in pure air and under the light of heaven?" Seems to me that that prescription, if you will, rings as loud today in 2025 as it did in the late 19th century. Thank you, Frederick Law Olmsted and Sons. Here's another nice picture. I love this one. It's one of my favorites. It's from the Boston Globe. I just love it. It so captures him so nicely. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I will open to questions, but let me quickly show you some books. I'm going to flash forward. I think all of you will recognize some of the classics. I'm going to flash forward to a couple in particular I want to call to your attention. Here is Sarah Cedar Miller's recent masterwork, Before Central Park. But here's the two or three I want to call to your attention. The Power of Scenery, Frederick Law Olmsted and the Origin of National Parks by Dennis Drabel, and I'm hoping I'm pronouncing Dennis's surname correctly. I highly recommend it. Equally highly recommend this, Olmsted in Yosemite, Civil War, Abolition, and the National Park Idea. I don't have a picture up for you, but I was reminded in doing some rereading and research for this that the classic text for many of us in our line of work, and certainly I know for people like Michael Kellett and Susan Massino, is Wilderness and the American Mind by Roderick Nash. And if we have young scholars with us, young park advocates with us, if you've not read Wilderness and the American Mind by Roderick Nash, add it to your bookshelf and start reading it now. So that concludes the program. Happy to, I might have a contact. Oh, here's yet more books. I'm going to flash by these books. And here is the, if you want to take a screenshot, this is the rather complicated URL that takes you to our proprietary website for the film. But I tell you what, just Google the title of the film, Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing America. It's available for those of you who have PBS Passport at pbs.org. Here's my contact information, and I'll conclude and take questions. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks for bearing with me. That's it. I'm done.
Yes, thank you. This was phenomenal. We will be sending a recording to everyone. That was truly a tour de force about Frederick Law Olmsted. And I want to open the floor to questions if people want to raise their hand. And I wanted to maybe offer the first opportunity for a question to my colleague and partner in this series, Michael Kellett.
Thank you, Susan. You sort of touched on this, Larry, and at the end there, but I'm wondering, one of the things that we are talking about now is expanding the national park system for climate and biodiversity and people and how important that is. How do you have any thoughts on 100 and some odd years after Frederick Law Olmsted's passing on, what his thoughts might be as to how to make that argument to support that idea? Because I think he probably would have a lot of ideas, but what do you think?
He would have a lot of ideas, no doubt, and he'd be very engaged in the conversation, Michael. And of course, and I know you're involved with this very project at so many levels. And sometimes we might have to draw a distinction between protected wilderness areas versus national parks. That's number one, and it's important to understand the difference. But vis-a-vis national park, he wanted he wanted to support human immersion into nature. and to derive the benefits of nature. And Susan, of course, has a lot to say about that in her scholarship in terms of the psychological aspect of the experience. And both in urban settings and in rural settings. And most people associate them with the urban parks, and they don't realize the involvement with larger nature parks, such as landscape scale parks, such as Yosemite. And he knew we had a growing population, certainly back then in our urban environments, but also that our population was pushing west. And California was booming at the time that he was there. It was the beginning of the boom, really. And he wanted to make sure that California set aside its own tracts of land. And eventually, of course, interestingly enough, Junior becomes quite involved in California with both regional parks and state parks, very much carrying on in his father's footsteps. And of course, wrote the language, the very authorizing language for the Organic Act, which created our National Park Service, as a federal agency. Olmsted would be dealing with all of the political and economic forces that we're all confronting today in one way or another. And many of those issues pre-existed before the current occupant of the White House. Um, we do, and there are management issues that we all must contend with when it comes to setting aside, creating new, large protected landscapes. And I think a model that we might consider, and I think it's something that you've probably considered with your proposals in Maine, is something more akin to the Adirondack model, where you have inholdings that are grandfathered in, but a larger, again, landscape scale protected landscape that might have other activities such as ranches, et cetera, farming, maybe even villages grandfathered in, as in the case of the Adirondacks, but it's a larger protected landscape that protects the biologic diversity and creates avenues for greater human access to those landscapes with minimal but important human infrastructure, such as access roads, visitor centers, trails, public amenities. He'd be all for it. He'd be joining with you in your campaigns in Maine and New England and beyond. And he would be fighting the fight with gusto. And he'd be making profound philosophical and much more eloquent arguments on that behalf than I'm capable of doing right now in answer to your question.
Yeah, I'd love
Uh-huh.
to follow up on that because related to eloquent arguments, you mentioned, you can't really imagine New York City without
Mhm.
Central Park. And if you really know the United States, it's hard to imagine the US without our incredible national parks, which have been a model for the rest of the world.
Mhm.
And I think that phrase that you used, I wrote it down, the symphonic sequence of beautiful spaces. Adding more national parks to our portfolio in the United States would make that symphonic sequence really a national vision. And the thing I love about the vision for new national parks is it would bring national parks to densely populated areas which don't have any national parks, like most of New England, and many other parts of the country don't have these kind of special areas that are really dedicated to our natural and cultural history. So I'm, I'm very excited about that vision. And I think rather than trying to retrench and hold on to crumbs, we need to really think big about truth and beauty and, these kind of aspirational values that bring all of us up and all of our potential as humans in a liberal arts way that you talked about also very eloquently in terms of the humanities and all of the different disciplines. And I know that Olmsted had said Yosemite was should be protected for science and for art, which I also thought was a very inspiring point. So, related to this kind of national scope, I wanted to give you a chance to talk about the film that you just premiered,
Oh,
which is sort of about America and its beauty. And could I put you on the spot to say a little bit about this exciting project?
Well, uh, thanks, Susan. I wasn't actually planning to mention it, but since you've prodded me, and actually I know you're a fan of the prior film too, so I'll mention that because it all connects. The prior film that I co-produced was called Stewart Udall, The Politics of Beauty, and that is very much of a theme of what we're all talking about and focused on here today. And it talks about a certain time in American politics when, uh, despite social tension and political discord in the 1960s and 70s, when Stewart Udall was Secretary of the Interior under both JFK and LBJ, he and the leaders of the time, Republican and Democrat, working together, added huge chunks of land and waters, and to protect our public lands and public waters. And that's very significant. And that film is actually not yet been on public television, but it is available. That's Stewart Udall, The Politics of Beauty. And actually evolving from that, it's the same team that has just released our newest film called Katharine Lee Bates, From Sea to Shining Sea, Katharine Lee Bates and the Story of America the Beautiful. I don't want to take time to uh, get into the plot, but it tells the story of the rather unknown, rather shy poet, Katharine Lee Bates, born and raised in Falmouth, spent her career teaching at Wellesley College, who in 1893 took a train trip across America with her female partner to Niagara Falls, then to the White City, the Chicago World's Fair, and then onwards to Colorado Springs, where she had a summer teaching appointment at Colorado College. She visited the summit of Pikes Peak by mule and wagon, came off the summit of Pikes Peak, and wrote the first verses for the poem America that we now know as the beloved hymn, America the Beautiful. Now, this is where I don't want to get bogged down in the weeds, but let's just say that if you see this film, which is just being rolled out across the country, you will learn that her inspiration for writing some of the stanzas of America the Beautiful aren't quite what we imagine them to be. So there's a bit of a tease. It is a call to a higher level of patriotism as manifested by Abe Lincoln. And it is a celebration of the love of our landscape, but it's an aspirational song, which also is a critique of the social inequities in America of the late 19th century, and also a critique of the imperialistic bent of our foreign policy in the last decade of the 19th and early 20th century. And it's quite surprising and quite revealing, and a lot of people don't know that. And that's all there in the four stanzas of that tune as it is published and occasionally sung today. So we're offering that as a bromide, if you will, to plans for our national celebration of America 250. We want to make sure that people understand that this beloved hymn, which celebrates the landscape, is also an aspirational call for something greater as a people, that maybe we haven't yet met that ideal, that the beauty of our civics and the beauty of our polity and the beauty of our public behavior hasn't quite yet reached or the level of the beauty of our landscape. And we need to by keeping the majesty of our landscape in mind, it can raise us all up and bring us all together as a people, no matter the divisions. I'll leave it at that. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to present that. Yeah.
Thank you, Larry. And I
Yeah.
will also
Yeah.
say that the film will be coming to Connecticut this fall, and we'll be showing it at Trinity. So save the date, October 16th or 17th. We're going to show The Politics of Beauty. And From Sea to Shining Sea is a way to sort of kicking off the 250th in Hartford. And many of you know that Olmsted was born in Hartford, so I've really had a real soft spot for his vision and his work and his legacy in Hartford, where Trinity College is. I would like to invite the president of Atton Forest, on the board of Atton Forest. Billy Gridley said he has a question. Billy, please. Well, he typed it in.
Oh.
So in case, I'll read the question in case people are not looking. So Billy said, the Olmsted's world had fewer people and more available space. In this urbanizing world, what to do? Of course, we need more wild protected places, but as Susan said, we need urban parks and hybrid places. How would Olmsted have designed smaller and more intimate, accessible spaces? The grand scale is so worthy, but so are the backyards. So I want to comment on that briefly, and then I will turn it over to Laurence Cotton. So one thing I thought that was really visionary of Olmsted is how he planted native plants in the places he designed in cities, and how his intent was to use these small places in cities as a window to the wider world. So, and now we know scientifically that these small places are also stepping stones for wildlife to be able to move across the landscape. So I always say we need places great and small, but I don't know, what would you say, Larry?
Yes, and good point. And also remember, in places like Buffalo, Boston, Louisville, uh, among others, it was a connected linkage. Greater Boston, of course, that was Charles Eliot. Formerly the MDC parks. Now it's Metro Parks for the city of Boston. But Eliot started out with the Olmsteds, so he took his his grand scheme, I think, came under the Olmsted influence. And there are other parks. Obviously, I already referenced both East Bay, Berkeley, and Metro Denver. But both of your comments, Michael and Susan, reminded me Cuyahoga National Park. Now, just on the outskirts of Cleveland, it is a national park. It includes culture, history, nature, and it's connected to the other emerald necklace. Cleveland has its own emerald necklace, not master planned by the Olmsteds, but they use that same term. And with the county park system, a wonderful county park system, there are connecting linkage trails that are being completed to the relatively new national park just on the outskirts of Cleveland. And that's a well-developed city. And all of a sudden we have a new national park on the outskirts of a well-developed old East Coast or Midwest so-called Rust Belt city. They did it in Cleveland. Why can't we do similar, create similar? By the way, it's not that large a park. I don't know what its entire acreage is. It's a mid-sized park, but it certainly isn't a huge national park. It's a suburban park for Cleveland. But I think that's one example I would use. And I think Olmsted would argue that there's a place for more of those kinds of regional parks, which might have national prestige or national moniker attached to them and that level of protection, but they tie into other regional county and city parks, again, as in the case of Cleveland, which I think is a wonderful model. So there
That's
you
a
go.
great comment.
Yeah.
I know that Michael
Yeah.
may have a comment, but I know that in this vision for new national parks, Michael has taken into account this kind of like linkages and connecting to other parks. Related to Cuyahoga, there was a landscape architect who did community surveys about that park for what would the community want. And the community, in fact, didn't even really know about the national park, which was, you know, already like, wow, people don't know about these amazing places that are right in their backyard. And I've found the same thing where I live or in Hartford. You know, we have an old growth forest in Keeney Park in Hartford, which is Olmsted's childhood landscape, and people simply don't know it's there. But from this community survey, there was a whole bunch of meetings saying, what would you like to do? You know, what would you like to do if you go to the park or down to the river? And they thought that people would talk about fishing and biking and hiking and all kinds of things. The most predominant answer, do you remember, do you know what I'm talking about? This was amazing to me, was relax. That was what people wanted to do. Just relax, and just like Olmsted knew intuitively, people just want to enjoy being in these beautiful places. And anyway, Michael, did you want to make any comments about that too?
Just one of the things we're thinking about in terms of expanding national parks is that we need to expand our thinking about what is nationally important. And I
Mhm.
think one of the things, just what we're talking about, it's really important for people living in big cities. Most people live in cities now, to have a place that's green and beautiful and comforting and peaceful. And that's not just a local, I mean, there are local parks, but that's goes beyond just a local concern. That's really a national benefit to have those places. That doesn't mean all local parks need to be national parks, but we really ought to think differently about the national importance of these places. And some places that now are sort of seen as, oh, well, no big deal, really probably should be national parks. For example, Walden Woods is on our list, which is outside of Boston.
Right.
It's not gigantic like Yellowstone or whatever, but this is a place with international importance. But it's also important to people in the Boston area
Mhm.
to have a green place to go. People go there and just to get away and get to the woods. So we need to. I really think that that way of looking at things is actually more important than ever. With the more as we have more people, less open space available, and we need to think about national parks as more than just big mountains and deep valleys and canyons and whatever. And so now's a good time to rethink.
Thank you. I want to highlight a comment that Deborah Asquith uh, put in the chat, where she's talking about students. And for those of you who don't know, all fourth graders and their families have free entry to all of the national parks, and so do all disabled people. So the national parks has been really committed to bringing kids and their families for the kind of early experience that was so profound in Olmsted's life, and for anyone with a disability, and they have a very wide definition of disabilities. So we're coming up upon summertime, and this is a great time to visit these beautiful national parks. I am so deeply grateful for, I look kind of like a ghost. I have odd lighting tonight,
Mhm.
but I'm so deeply grateful for this wonderful tour de force, as I said earlier. And I wanted to see if Michael or Dina had any final comments.
No, I certainly don't. I think the this is a natural segue to the future, I think. Or the Juliana has a comment, I think.
Please, Juliana. I think Juliana disappeared. Well,
Uh-oh.
in case Juliana comes back, we could entertain her question.
Oh,
Oh, her
Well,
mic is not working. If you want to type it
um,
in the chat, I'm happy to. Yeah, I don't know why that's happening. Um, anyway, we are going to have more talks in this series, and you will all receive the recording and an invitation to future talks. As I said, please get on the Restore email list. Michael sends out informative, infrequent emails and absolutely no spam, scientific articles of interest and information about national parks and new national parks. And definitely keep your eyes out for From Sea to Shining Sea, the film we just discussed. And if you are in New England in the fall, I hope you will come and see it in person at Trinity on October 16th or 17th. Larry, did you have any other final comments?
Firstly, I just wanted to thank you, Susan and Michael and Dina, for allowing me to join you today. It's been an honor. I also wanted to mention regarding From Sea to Shining Sea, we're in conversation with public television. We hope that this version, which is the shorter version or a somewhat longer version, will yet appear on public television screens, assuming public television still exists in some form in the middle term future. But I also want to, I think I'm guessing most everyone who signed on here is a New Englander. Just so happens that we have the premiere at the July 4th concert at the waterfront in Boston. The Boston Pops has commissioned a brand new musical piece. It's a special audio-visual production It's hard to even explain, but there's going to be a musical and audiovisual tribute to Katharine Lee Bates as part of the July 4th concert. And they're using our visuals and our script to create this brand new tribute, which is going to be unveiled to the public in early June at Symphony Hall for the first premiere, but the second big show will be at the July 4th concert at the waterfront. And anyone out there who wants to be in Boston on July 4, you might experience even something more than the usual program. So last little bit promotion there, and that's a free concert, obviously. Anyway, thanks to everyone. Nice to join all of you today.
Thank you so much. And feel free, anyone can feel free to reach out to Larry or myself or Michael. And I hope we can continue this important conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, and
Thanks.
thanks, Larry.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Good to see everyone. Bye-bye now.